Our name is Jonathan Meades, and this series is called Abroad Again. It lifts the stones of British buildings to reveal the life forms beneath them. Follow us down a B-road of discovery, down life's lonely highway of adventure. So, abroad again, for monuments that live and for their maker who might never have done. Cuthbert Brodrick died at the age of 83 in his rented villa at Gorey St Martin on Jersey on March the 2nd, 1905. Brodrick? The architect? He's been dead for years. And, in a manner of speaking, so he had. Cuthbert Brodrick had, of course, outlived his time, which is a not uncommon fate, but he had always been outside his time. Even at the moment of his greatest triumph over half a century before in 1853, he was out of key with his time, almost perversely and ultimately self-defeatingly out of key with his time. He came from nowhere at the age of 30, and before he was 45, he was gone. There was never a career like his. He was lauded. He was briefly the most celebrated architect in the country. Yet he left behind him nothing but a few buildings. The most extraordinary buildings of that most extraordinary age. We know little of him and never will. There is a chimerical quality about him. Those buildings apart, he might never have existed. He is secretive in death as he was in life. Brodrick was an individualist and a nonconformist in a society of individualists and nonconformists. Yet his individualism was to prove too individualistic and his nonconformity too nonconformist. There exist limits. This was surely not a self-conscious posture. He appears to have had no choice in the matter. For year upon year, Brodrick craved to repeat the huge success that he had once enjoyed. But there was something in the mix that made him quite unable to adapt. Pride, no gift for jobbery, arrogance, lack of clubbability, aesthetic bloody-mindedness, a distaste for new fashions, diffidence, indifference to propriety. Save for 1 year, a very important year, Cuthbert Brodrick lived until he was 32 in his native city of Hull. He went to school there. He met his love there. Like many artists, he didn't really have to struggle. His father, a prosperous ship owner, paid the hefty premium for his architectural articles, which he began a fortnight after his 15th birthday. His precocious drawings bear witness to his fascination with buildings. He must already have been sufficiently fascinated by them to know that designing them would be his life, if only it had been so simple. As a child and young man, Brodrick frequented the flatlands of the East Riding, which are haunted, lunar, determined by tides which shape them down the years, eroding shores, shifting silt and building bars. Spurn Point sinks, Sunk Island rises. Sea walls and gabions bear witness to the German Ocean's malevolence. There rolls the deep, where grew the tree. O earth, what changes thou hast seen? Tennyson. English watercolour techniques were developed to represent the peculiar luminescence of the eastern counties. It is, however, not only painters who respond to these phenomena. Buildings are obviously, at a functional level, partly determined by topography and weather. Indeed, a building is a coarse barometer. A steeped pitch roof indicates heavy rainfall. The small windows counter the sun's assault, and so on. But architecture incorporates, too, a further set of reactions to landscape and to climate, autobiographical reactions. Cuthbert Brodrick's works do not need to declaim their permanence. They do not need to be bastions against meteorological aggression. It's as though they are constructed in response to nightmares of erosion, of the brutal sea, of inundation. Brodrick's buildings respond to the elements by being as elemental as the elements, by asserting mankind's supremacy over them. They are founded in a pathology over which he had little control. Spires soar towards heaven. Brodrick's towering skylines offer no such hope. They serve only to point the other way, to the preposterous vanity of hoping to escape the squalor of the grave. They tell us that we'll all be compost soon. We'll be a feast for blowflies, necrophorous beetles, parasitoid wasps. That's our fate, to be humiliated at a buffet in the dark. A cemetery. The lodge to a cemetery was the first commission that Brodrick received when, still supported by his father, he set up by himself at the age of 22. Brodrick had yet to become Brodrick. Even if he had yet to unearth the idiom that was his own, there is necessarily an intimation of mortality in any building made for necropolitan purposes. At least there was in the mid-19th century, an age which was as fixated by death as we are shy of it. Brodrick's architecture may not have been stylistically typical of its age, but the sensibility it expressed and the fears it revealed were typical. His earliest career, too, was typical enough. Hull today is reckoned to be the worst place to live in Britain, yet it calls itself a global gateway. The Philip Larkin who wrote, "They f*** you up, your mum and dad," could have lived anywhere. The Larkin who said, "Deprivation is for me what daffodils were for Wordsworth," could have lived nowhere else but Hull. Hull in the 1820s and 30s was not yet a global gateway, but it was nonetheless a great port. England's Arctic whaling industry was based here, and it traded with the Baltic and the Netherlands. It possessed buildings appropriate to its status, buildings which adhered to the classical consensus. The industrial tradition derived its proportions from that consensus. Towns like Hull enjoyed an extraordinary degree of self-determination. They did not take their cue from London. They considered themselves to be de facto city-states, mercantile principalities. Until the advent of the railway in the late 1830s, Hull was 3 days distant from London. It was as close to the ports of northern Germany and the Netherlands as it was to London. Sail ships were swifter than stagecoaches. The proximity and cultural pull of those ports was significant. It was architecturally manifest all the length of the watercolour counties. For 7 years, Cuthbert Brodrick worked in the office of Henry Lockwood, an architect and industrious businessman. Lockwood possessed a facile versatility and an eagerness to please. But then he sought a career. His clever pupil Brodrick, whose gift as a watercolourist of architectural perspectives was already apparent, merely sought immortality through buildings which speak of its very opposite. Whilst awaiting immortality, he completed his articles and travelled for a year, 1844 to 45, again at his father's expense, in Italy and France. The Italy that fascinated him was that of the architectural past. The France that captivated him was modern, new. It was the France of the architectural present, a present that was pregnant with possibilities for his future. In the 1840s, French architecture was less riven than British architecture. In Britain, preposterous ethical and religious claims were made for the propriety of this or that aesthetic system. The evangelical revival of those years linked pointed arches to Christian virtue, tracery to piety. Brodrick subscribed to the French take on the Gothic, that it was a means of construction rather than a stick to instill the fear of God. In the 1840s, the Gothic and Romanesque revivals had hardly touched France. New architecture in France meant classicism, a more assertive classicism than that which remained reasonably commonplace in England. France's innate fondness for megalomaniac gigantism was constant, and so too was its inventive eclecticism constant. The English preoccupation with archaeologically precise recreation was one that French architecture seldom shared. It does not pretend that its buildings have time-travelled from another age. It does not try to dissemble its modernity. Those months that Brodrick spent in Paris, the capital of the 19th century in Walter Benjamin's phrase, seem to have had little effect in broadening his taste. Indeed, they merely concentrated his biases towards the columnar, the monumental, the monolithic, and, above all, towards France. Those months so entirely marked Brodrick that he would become a French architect, the greatest French architect to have been born and to have worked in the département called Yorkshire. After his return from Paris, Brodrick scraped a living in the flatlands. Henry Lockwood, to whom he had been articled, offered him a partnership which he declined. He secured a few minor commissions which give no indication of what he was capable of. Brodrick was the sort of artist who needs to work for full orchestra on a symphonic scale. His commissions were ukulele for beginners, and he appears to have despised them and despised himself for having to undertake them. At the age of 30, he was still living at home, was still largely supported by his father. You know the type, the attic fantasist. The rest of the world has yet to acknowledge his gift. And then, astonishingly, the world did acknowledge it. The competition in 1852 for Leeds Town Hall stipulated a grand design, a mean budget, a meaner prize, hence only 16 entrants. Brodrick might have been old to be living under his parents' roof, but he was young to win such a competition. That he won was due to the support of Sir Charles Barry, the architect of the Houses of Parliament, who was the first among the equal assessors and a discriminate judge. Almost 2 decades previously, he had recognised the gifts of Pugin, the arch-Gothicist who, stylistically, could hardly have been more distant from Brodrick. But Barry understood that there is only one school of architecture that matters, the school of talent. Leeds was the first English city to commission a single building to incorporate council chambers, town clerks' offices, mayoral parlour, assize courts, assembly rooms, concert halls, and so on. This was not, of course, merely for municipal convenience, but for size, which the promoters of the town hall realised would bring recognition to Leeds. Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, and even Leeds's smaller neighbour Bradford had, over the previous few years, all erected buildings, not necessarily town halls, of symbolic as well as utilitarian efficacy. Trade halls and assembly halls, intended to represent industry's confidence, scientific progress, mercantile valour, Christian endeavour, virtue through labour, the improving tonic of high art, and, above all, the power that attaches to our city. We have more civic muscle than you. This symbolic representative function of Leeds Town Hall increased during the period of its gestation and construction. In Brodrick's earlier scheme, the only thing that rose above the uninflected parapet was a low story, reminiscent of a theatre's fly tower in the centre. The initial design was pure, chaste, classically correct. The design that was built was gloriously impure, hardly chaste, classically far from correct. A magnificently sullen, passive building was transformed into a magnificently sullen, aggressive one at the behest of the Hall's promoters, who realised that the building was, as Sir Charles Barry had predicted, more than a parochial emblem, more even than the most perfect architectural gem outside London. It was attracting international attention and thus might bring commensurate kudos to the city. The budget was increased. The prodigious young architect devised a tower, a gesture of frightening self-confidence and exemplary self-importance. Leeds Town Hall is an unforgettable sight. It tattoos your retina. It first tattooed mine 30 years ago. There is a remarkable tension between the counterintuitive tower and the body of the building. This tension is not merely between the vertical and the horizontal. There is also a calculated stylistic change. Leeds Town Hall is an unforgettable sight. The building itself uses the device of columns and pilasters monotonously, though as Sir Cheverel Sitwell wrote of the northern Castilian landscape, it may be monotony, but it's the most magnificent monotony in the world. It is sympathetic to the French classicism, which remained constant between the revolutions of 1789 and 1848, even though that form of classicism shunned towers and domes, and this particular tower belongs in spirit to the Second Empire. The accession of Napoleon III in 1848 occasioned and perhaps encouraged the creation of an architecture that was opulent and coarse. This was the French analogue of the English High Victorian manner. It was a stylistic free-for-all. The shackles were off. Buildings were encrusted with imaginary vegetables, fabulous fugitives from aquaria and aviaries, brackets like the fossils of giants, mythological zoos, bizarre miscegenations. This was frivolity done in absolute earnest, grand guignol in overworked stone. The same progressive eclecticism and farouche adventurousness reigned on both sides of the Channel. But in Britain, the precedents that were torn apart and reassembled by wild imaginations were Gothic rather than classical. Stern, sullen, harsh, morbid, brutal. Its humours were all dark. There was no invocation of pleasure. The French notion of frivolity was unthinkable. This was earnestness done in absolute earnest. Brodrick's work shares these sombre English moods, but the devices he used to express them were French, mostly. He was a mongrel of genius, never quite in step with his own nation or with that whose architecture preoccupied him. To English eyes he seems French, to French eyes English. The classicism that was Brodrick's initial inspiration had dispensed with the characteristic that had defined grand French architecture since the Middle Ages. The fantastical skyline, the top-heavy roofscape of pyramids, pavilions and ogies had disappeared. The restless silhouette was lost. Brodrick rediscovered it. Just as the flatlands are relieved by spires and towers, so is the parapet inflected by strapping malevolent urns lurking in couples. They're funerary, ominous. But even these are no match for the dome. Domes are not meant to be concave. There is some terrible abnormality here. It's like a satanic freak show devised by Beardsley or by Victor Hugo, who wrote, "Deformity is akin to sublimity." Indeed, the building's entire exterior exhibits a taste for monstrous perversity in stone. The stone is a hard carboniferous sandstone called millstone grit. Brodrick exploited its properties from the outset. It cannot be worked delicately. It lends itself to gigantism, solidity, and this sort of rustication, vermicular. That is, it's in the form of worms, bloated worms. The stone is appropriate to the composition of a building against whose display of permanence mankind can measure its term. The depth and disproportion of the attic story are a reproach to vanity. This building puts us in our place as surely as any great cathedral. It tells us that the city-state of Leeds will exist long after its current crop of citizens is dead. More, it tells us of its maker's faith, hardly untouched by vanity, that his great art would still be lowering to us long after his death, and that he might achieve a kind of immortality, or at least an extension of renown beyond the grave, by the disposition of 300-million-year-old blocks of the Earth's crust. Expressionism and individualism. These were characteristics of the 1850s and 60s, along with vigor, energy, drama. Architects abandoned the old templates and pursued innovation, structural as well as stylistic. The results were as uncompromising as the architecture of the 1960s. Leeds Town Hall was inaugurated on September the 7th, 1858, by Queen Victoria and the Prince Consort. Brodrick, now 36, was author of the most celebrated public building of the age. He was no longer, as Sir Charles Barry observed, a Mr. Brodrick. Henceforth, his name will not have to be prefaced by A. Yet throughout the Town Hall's 6-year gestation, he undertook only 2 other commissions of any importance. He can't have known that this was a presage of what was to come, and it must be counted a failure given the reputation that now attached to him. What was the problem? No gift for jobbery, aesthetic bloody-mindedness, diffidence, lack of clubbability. One might add to this inventory the arrogance that comes from having won so great a prize so young, and a costive unwillingness to delegate, to turn himself into the titular head of an architectural factory in which human computers churned out the Brodrick style. The point is, there was no such thing as the Brodrick style, only the Brodrick sensibility, which would evidently have been more difficult to replicate. Like Picasso, whose work he lived long enough to have seen, Brodrick's dictum might have been, copy anyone but never copy yourself. This former hotel near Ilkley is the only instance of him copying an English source. The English source was John Vanbrugh, the least English of English architects and the most likely to overwhelm with scale and to occasion joy through sheer lugubriousness. Vanbrugh had a marked hold on the imagination of Claude Nicolas Ledoux, who was born in 1736, 10 years after Vanbrugh died. Ledoux would not have existed without Vanbrugh, and it was from Ledoux that French neoclassicism derived. Ledoux's sanctioning of Vanbrugh must have commended him to Brodrick, who, and he must have known it, was Vanbrugh's heir. Few architects have ever been able to create such thrillingly epic gloom as Vanbrugh and Brodrick. Few have been so preoccupied with the immeasurable quality of mood. Brodrick knew that the path to temporal greatness and subsequent immortality was not paved with provincial rectories, board schools and future pizza parlours. Most of the bread and butter work he undertook was diocesan dross, executed at best with diffidence, at worst with apparent contempt. Leeds Town Hall had confirmed what he already knew, that he had to work on the grandest of canvases. Most opportunities to do so were only to be obtained by entering time-consuming and unprofitable competitions. This was how patrons hedged their bets, exploited a surfeit of architects. It wasn't a lottery. It was the old Pals Act wearing a mantle of equity. Brodrick's early success was atypical, in that he was rewarded for talent rather than trouser rolling. Some of those he entered were Preston Town Hall, the project was abandoned. The government offices in Whitehall. George Gilbert Scott, who came only third in the competition, was sufficiently adept at jobbery to eventually secure the commission. Indeed, so adept that he did so despite Palmerston's opposition. Manchester Assizes. Alfred Waterhouse won this competition. He proceeded to build up one of the major architectural factories in Britain. Lille Cathedral. Brodrick knew the way the stylistic tide was turning. The Gothic was no longer restricted to churches. His spidery creations are the school of Gothic called opportunistic. Once Leeds Town Hall was completed, Brodrick's star rose, in Yorkshire anyway. He won 3 competitions in 18 months at the turn of the 1860s. Hull Town Hall was a modest work, done on a minimal budget. It was demolished after less than half a century. Parts of it were recycled and bodged together to form a First World War memorial. Further parts of it are strewn about the same flatlands village of Brantingham. And its cupola is now a sort of folly or ad hoc thing in one of the city's parks. The second competition he won was for the Leeds Mechanic Institution, a fabulously lugubrious work. It was described as a leaden coffin, sepulchral, heavy. Its disproportionate roof appears to have suffered an amputation. The third competition that Brodrick won in the early 1860s was for Leeds's Corn Exchange. The source was doubly predictable, Parisian and a corn exchange. It is now La Bourse du Commerce. was equally predictable that Brodrick should create a building distant from its source. He was the kind of artist who stole ideas as triggers that enabled him to design as he had not designed before, and to design something quite unlike anything attempted by his contemporaries. Of course, Brodrick's signature is unmistakable. It transcends style. The swaggering weight, the unalloyed monumentalism, the just controlled aggression, the saturnine glare, and the amazing precision of the stonework, which glorifies mechanical precision. Brodrick's art shuns the approximate and the handmade. His buildings do not leave a trail indicating how they're done. They are performances that dissemble their rehearsal. There is an element of legerdemain. The Bourse de Commerce is circular, utilitarian, minimally decorated. Brodrick's Corn Exchange is none of those. Structure and decoration are indivisible. Every external surface is relentlessly rusticated, with stones faceted. The effect is to persuade the spectator that what is being witnessed is trompe-l'oeil. Artifice is aped by the actual. This ocular trickery is matched by the building's spatial deceptions. It is, disconcertingly, ovalloid. The roof is wonderfully bizarre. It might be an exercise in proto-op art. You do not have to gape at it for long, for all sense of perspective and direction to dissipate. It's as though we've boarded a static airship and are suffering a delusion of motion. It incites something akin to a state of psychotropic impairment. Brodrick's fourth great Leeds building no longer survives. It was demolished in 1969. It was a singular example of the Victorian mania for Turkish baths. Turkish baths were not Turkish. They were rather a reworking of Roman baths. They were a device dreamed up by the monomaniacal Turkophile MP David Urquhart. Their purpose was to foment sympathy for Turkey, which Urquhart saw as a bulwark against Russia. Of the 140 or so baths that were purpose-built, less than a dozen affected Turkish dress, and none of them did so with the extravagance of Brodrick's. He invented his own Islamic mode, uncontaminated by actual precedents. The fashion for seaside resorts has endured far longer than that for Turkish baths. Scarborough's transformation from modest spa to such a resort was affected by the coming of the railway in 1845. The Grand Hotel, which followed in 1867, belongs to the first age of mass tourism. It is indeed the first and the grandest of grand hotels, and the biggest. No building in Europe had ever consumed so many bricks. It was as different as could be from home. It was a palace for the people, a site of fantasy. The palace of Aladdin of our youth was one contemporary description, which makes one wonder about the writer's youth. Brodrick's notion of fantasy was not to be found in recalling childhood entertainments, but in, as ever, emulating France, where frivolity was a serious and licentious business. The Grand's opening banquet offered 9 courses and 51 dishes, the majority of them misspelled. The decorative carvings are sumptuously Second Empire. It is unthinkable that an architect of public buildings of this date would have stolen so wantonly from France, which was increasingly regarded with a prudish prurience. English architecture was turning towards a cheerless municipal Gothic, which signalled God-fearing probity and the despisal of pleasure. It possesses a truly aggressive presence. It's an urban punctuation mark which reduces everything around it. It is man-made, but its minatory potency seems extra-human. It feels like a force of nature. It transcends mere architecture. It certainly transcends the purpose it was built for. It might be the site of the main rituals of a civilization that has disappeared, yet of which we carry a memory that we cannot quite exhume. It might be... What it is, unconditionally, is a prodigy of sublimity that excites a terrible awe, and it's a monument to Cuthbert Brodrick, who was not above hymning himself. His painting of the Grand was being exhibited at the Royal Academy when the hotel opened. Throughout the period of the hotel's construction, he had continued to design tirelessly, entering competition after competition. The competition for Bolton Town Hall was won by William Hill, a Leeds architect, with a design that feebly copied Leeds Town Hall, or rather, copied Brodrick's mannerisms without his substance. Brodrick was affronted. He was doubly affronted when Bolton Council asked him to help Hill improve his plagiarism. Brodrick won none of these competitions. He was 45 when the Grand opened in the summer of 1867. Atkinson Grimshaw, who lived in Leeds and whose early work was exhibited at the Mechanics' Institution, was almost certainly known to Brodrick. However, whether Brodrick ever saw this or any other of the Scarborough nocturnes which Grimshaw painted in the 1870s is moot, for by then Brodrick had gone. The Grand had been the last building he would ever make. What happened? The curtailment of his career is as singular as the work that that career produced. A combination of factors seems to have militated against him. The Grand had bankrupted the consortium which commissioned it, and Leeds Town Hall had become a byword for profligacy. It cost 4 times the original budget. Then there's the matter of Brodrick's stylistic obstinacy. Style always counts for more than talent to those who blithely laud artists for being ahead of their time or who deprecate them for, horror of horrors, conservatism. In actual fact, neither epithet is appropriate in the discussion of art. And then there was Brodrick's francophilia, inopportune at a time when there existed a national paranoia about Napoleon III's supposedly bellicose intentions. The French socialist Louis Blanc, who lived in exile in England throughout the Second Empire, wrote, "The English are tormented by a spectre called invasion. Why is it that England and France are more effectively separated by suspicion than by the Channel?" Cuthbert Brodrick didn't subscribe to such superstition. Sometime in 1869, he left England for France. He left with the woman who had been his lover for 15, possibly 20 years. Margaret Chatham was 7 years Brodrick's senior. She was Catholic, a shoemaker's daughter from York who had married a Hull solicitor, William Chatham. She bore him 4 children. She would abandon them all for Brodrick, the Bohemian architect. They may have been together as early as 1850, when Brodrick was on the point of success and was still living in Hull at his parents' house. Margaret Chatham left her nearby marital home that year. Because of Brodrick? Did she persuade the Attic fantasist to enter the Leeds competition? Was she the making of him and his unmaking? Was it because their affair eventually became public that his work dried up? Having a mistress was one thing, but bolting, that was quite another. And as for failing in hypocrisy's obligation to sweep it under the carpet, Yorkshire's mores were not London's, and London's were not Paris's. Cuthbert Brodrick and Margaret Chatham arrived in a Paris which was in turmoil. Napoleon III was about to be overthrown as a result of his misjudged aggression towards Prussia, whose forces besieged Paris, causing the zoo to be eaten in the spring of 1871. Antipathy to the national government was widespread, and France suffered what was, in effect, a brief and bloody civil war. Cuthbert Brodrick and Margaret Chatham lived at a variety of addresses in inner Paris and Neuilly before buying the first house that he had ever owned, in Le Vésinet, a Paris suburb. Le Vésinet is a kind of proto-garden suburb. Brodrick had known it since 1861, when Louis-Auguste Boileau built an iron and concrete church here. It was popular with artists. Paul Abadie, the architect of Sacré-Cœur of Montmartre, lived here. So did the painters Vlaminck and Utrillo, and so did the musicians Bizet, Baudouin d'Ademenugon, and Monique Cerf. Brodrick never again practiced architecture. He tended his garden here in the Avenue de Bellois. He is supposed to have painted and exhibited. Did he? Why should he have done anything? The whereabouts of the paintings, if any, are unknown. The idea that this great artist did absolutely nothing is rather delicious. In 1885, William Chatham died in Hull. His still apparently Roman Catholic widow was now free to marry. When Cuthbert Brodrick was 63 and she was 70, they returned briefly to England, to Marylebone Registry Office. Margaret Brodrick died 3 years later. She's buried here in Le Vésinet in a worn-out grave. Cuthbert Brodrick couldn't bear to go on living in the house that they had shared. He sold it and moved to the Channel Islands. In his final years, his niece Amy moved from Salisbury to care for him. Cuthbert Brodrick died at the age of 83 in his villa at Gorey St. Martin on Jersey on March the 2nd, 1905. Brodrick? Brodrick the architect? Died? Cuthbert Brodrick will never die. He built forever, thus he is forever. There's a quality about Brodrick that makes him eternal, which is no doubt what he'd have wanted. His brief, lustrous career was, after all, devoted to one thing, making monuments to himself. There was never anyone like him. There never will be anyone like him.
The natural beauty of the Pembrokeshire coast in a moment on BBC Two, and then at 8 it's all about the flowers. Chelsea's in full bloom, and boy are they putting on a show.